Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and this is part 2 of our show on the Shulman-Kamsky game from the U.S. Championships that just finished a couple of weeks ago. This is, again, not the last game, not the Armageddon game, but it was the last game of the quad final. It worked more or less, well, okay, it didn't work exactly the same way, but if either player had won this game, they would have won the championship immediately. So it came down to this game where it could have, and they drew, though, and then they went on to the Armageddon final, which Kamsky drew with black in the last game, and thereby became champion. Anyway, we left off last time in the position, let's get to it here, plowing through all of my analysis, right here. So, and I had put it as a challenge to the viewer to try to figure out how White could maybe win this position. Now, it's not a winning position, it's a theoretical position, but somehow it just seems wrong that it's not winning. I think I mentioned that last time, that when I first saw this position, I think as a master, maybe a near master, probably I was still an expert at that point in the early 80s, it just seemed to me somehow crazy that this position could be playable for black. Now, it was considered to be favorable for white, but not much favorable, maybe just a slight edge, which may still in fact be the case today. We'll see. Anyway, as a quick recap, let me show you how we get to that position and what we looked at last time. Again, only very, very briefly. So Shulman had white, so we have a Grunfeld, and it's the exchange variation. And it's this rook to b1 line, which has been popular since the early 80s. It really exploded in popularity then through the late 90s, and then a lot of the main lines seem to have kind of petered out into a draw. So castles, bishop to e2. And then here, the line that became most popular ultimately was c takes d4, c takes d4, queen a5 check, bishop d2, and queen takes a2, castles, and so on. And this has been analyzed to, well, just tremendous depth. If you're not a theory fan, you might think it's a nauseating depth. If you like theory, then it's kind of cool and interesting. But, I mean, there have probably been about 1,000 games in the database with this line, and I think it's more or less worked out. I mean, okay, all it takes is one new idea in some critical moment, at some critical point to overturn that. But at least for the moment, it seems to be more or less worked out to a draw, to black having full equality. All right, but the game that we're looking at focuses on the alternative line, which is the line that was, I think, more popular at first, and that's knight to c6. So here, white plays d5, which is a pawn sack, but it's one that almost no one accepts. So the standard way to go, and this is what we spent most of our time looking at last time, is knight to e5, takes, and then white wants to play f4, but here he does defend the c-pawn, so queen to d2. Let me see, by the way. Yeah, no one plays f4 here, which is a little bit funny, since white is willing to give up the pawn the move before, but apparently not here. Anyway, so queen to d2, and b6 is played sometimes, but e6 is the main move, f4, and then there are three moves here. There are two that are very similar, at least appear to be very similar, bishop to h8 and bishop to g7. And I noted that while each has its advantage relative to the other one, it looks like bishop to g7 is the only move that still survives. Bishop to h8 was more or less refuted in the game of Cambridge against Hjardarson from Grindavik in 1984. And we looked at that last time. In the bishop to g7 line, what really counts, or at least seems to be the most important thing at the moment, is the assessment of the ending that comes up here. So in the older games involving Novikov, e5 was the move. King f2, e4, bishop c6, king e5, h4, which seems to be a win. But Marin, and before that Kasparov, although Marin was the first person to actually play it, they found king to e5. And this is probably enough to equalize, although it's still a very complicated position. Marin actually went on to win with black against none other than this very same Yuri Shulman, but it was only because Shulman was over-pressing. In fact, there was one place where Marin himself was pressing a bit and may have put himself in great danger of losing. Anyway, this is, let's say, the key position perhaps of the bishop to g7 variation. And unfortunately that's, sometimes the way modern chess goes. You play bishop to g7 on move 13, and then you have to assess an endgame that begins on move 33. Okay, the third line is to play bishop to c7, which has the idea of preventing c4. Of course, it prevents it in pretty straightforward fashion here, as that would win the queen. And after castles, takes, and again bishop to a5. So this way the pawn on d5 isn't protected, and more importantly, white doesn't get to put his bishop and queen on the long diagonal against the black king. Okay, so that, as I said, was what we discussed last time. Now let's get to our position from the game. So bishop takes c3 check. Kamsky accepted this pawn sack line, accepted the pawn sack, and it's a line that's dangerous, but as I said, not clearly busted. So bishop to d2, takes. Sometimes black plays knight to d4 here, but it scores very poorly. I mean, white scores like 3-1 after that. Takes, and queen takes pawn. So knight a5 is the main move. I should say, the knight is kind of out of play, but it does do one very good thing there, and it's that it prevents bishop to c4. So white can't, at least very easily, bring that bishop into the kingside attack. Okay, h4, bishop to g4, and this is where we left off. And as I said, I challenged the viewers to try to find some way to bust black's position. It was a little disappointing. I mean, there were quite a few views of the show, but no one took up the challenge to try to look for some way for white to win, or at least to get really serious winning chances. And I think, you know, even if you don't think you're going to overturn opening theory by investigating, I still think it's a great position to analyze. Well, white has three main moves here, three reasonable approaches at least, and so we'll talk about them. So there's the move played in the game, which is knight to g5, which is a very interesting move. The idea of this is, well, to preserve the knight for the attack and to get rid of black's light-squared bishop so we can play a quick h5. However, you might think, well, why not just play h5 right away? Why not just do it straight off the bat? And we'll have a look at that. And then finally, we can even look at the really crude, but somewhat dangerous still, queen h6. Now, black has to be a bit careful here. If he plays the obvious f6 to stop knight to g5, well, the problem is that he hasn't stopped knight to g5. White does it anyway, threatening mate, and after fg, bishop takes g4, black is just losing. White threatens to take on g5 and to play bishop to e6 check, and this should decide the matter. For instance, if takes, check, rook takes h4, and just to stop the immediate mate is going to cost black everything. He has to play rook f7, we take the rook, then he has to play queen g8, and we take the queen, and then even that isn't good enough. King takes g8, queen h7 check, king f8, queen h8 check, king f7, rook to f4 is checkmate. So, f6 is quite bad, but it's quite natural. The right move and the only move is bishop takes f3. Now, gf, e5, and here white has a couple of reasonable ways to proceed, but I don't think either of them gives him any advantage. So, if h5, for instance, g5, rook to g1, f6, and now white can give himself some interesting chances with f4. The point being that on e takes f4 he has e5, and if f takes e5 then white mates or wins the queen with rook takes g5 and queen e6. So black should probably play king to h8, and now after d6, fe, rook g5, rook f7, bishop f3, and queen f8. White has very good compensation for the two pawns, but no more than that, I think. I think white has enough compensation, but doesn't have an advantage here. So it's an interesting line, and one that I think can be played by either side. And also a line I think that with some prep could be quite good. Okay, line 2. D takes e6 instead of h5, and only after fe, then play h5. Well, again, black is going to stay material up, and the other line was 2 pawns. Here it's just the 1 pawn. But again, I think black has enough resources to be okay. So king h8, getting out of the way of rook to g1. And the problem for white is that he'd really love to bring that rook from b1 over to g1, but he can't conveniently do it. I mean, if he plays king to d2, then black checks with the rook on the d file, and white's king is going to go on some adventures here, and not happy adventures either. So queen to c7 is probably best. b6, rook to d1, taking over the d file. And again, white has excellent compensation, but probably not more than that. So enough to be in good shape, but not clearly better. Okay, so queen h6 I think is very interesting, and it's very, very rarely played too. So I think that gives you some surprise value. All right, now let's take a look at h5, which in fact was played by Kamsky himself with white against Timon back in Linares in 1991. So a long time ago, but he has a little experience in this line too. And that game only ended in a draw as well. So there, and in many other games, black played bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and now the threat of queen h6 and h takes g6 is quite serious, so black needs to get his queen into the defense. So e5 is a good move. It does give it does give white this passed d pawn, but it's for the moment easily blockaded, and the pawn on e5 blockades the e and f pawns, so it's pretty useful. And black would like to play, if he could, I mean given time, like to play the knight over to d6, maybe play queen f6 and even queen f4 with a good position. And he's a pawn up. All right, so here white has a choice. Kamsky played queen to c3 in that game, and this is playable, but the main move, the most important move, is h takes g6. Now, hg is suicide because after queen h6, mate is unstoppable. So fg, d6, threatening queen to d5 check and regaining a pawn. And here black's best is probably b6, protecting everything on the queen side. Queen d5 check, queen takes e5, queen h2, h5. Now rook to d1 has been played, but queen to g3 is the main move, and I think the best move. And here black, well, almost all the last few moves have been forced, but here black has some choice. And I don't think that he's fully okay, though. I think white has some edge here. So to look at some lines. If rook a to d8, this looks quite sensible. We want to round up the d6 pawn. Well, rook to d1, knight c6. So again, trying to cut off the pawn. Well, to play knight to d4 and then grab it. But rook takes h5, knight to d4, and e5 leaves white clearly better. So as logical as rook a to d8 is, I don't think it equalizes. Likewise, I think rook a to e8 is inadequate too. Rook takes h5, check, and rook takes e4. See, this is the big idea with the point that if f takes e4, white just blunders the queen, taking advantage of this pin. But if white just plays d7, with, among other things, the idea of playing d8 queen, because then after rook takes, there's no more pin on the f file, and white can play f takes e4. Here I think white is clearly better. Okay, still another move is queen f4, but this doesn't seem to be all that great either. So I think white is clearly better here as well. And so the best try, I think, is knight to c6. And this was played by Igor Stoll, who's, I think, Czech Grandmaster. He was a Czech Grandmaster. I'm not sure which of those countries he's in now. And very good player, and also the author of really an excellent book. One of my, maybe favorites is a bit strong. Maybe one of my favorite contemporary books, Instructive Modern Chess Masterpieces. Very analysis heavy, so if you're looking for a book to read, that you can kind of read in bed, that's not the book. But it's definitely an excellent book with really serious analysis. Anyway, he had black here against Boris Gelfand back in Tilburg in '92, and this might be the best move. For a while he was okay, just maybe a little bit worse, but he missed something. So in this position, black to move, what should you do? See if you can figure out what the right move is. Well, the answer is probably, g takes f5 is at least playable. It doesn't feel like a good move. g5 feels like the good move, but this is a blunder. Do you see why? Gelfand forces resignation in one move with rook takes h5 check. So the problem is that if king takes h5, queen h3 is just checkmate. End of the game. And if king to g7, then rook takes g5 check is going to force mate or force heavy material losses from black, since if the king goes to the h file, then queen h4 is going to win the queen or give checkmate. If the king goes to f7, then bishop to c4 check wins a lot of stuff, so it's just game over here. But after f5, white's only a bit better, so this is still playable for black here. Alright, so now we've looked at the alternatives. So we looked at queen h6. It's dangerous, it's interesting, but probably not better for white. We looked at h5, which I think might actually be better for white. So I think this really does merit a closer look. By the way, I should mention, bishop takes h5 is no good, if only because of simply g4. Bishop takes g4, queen h6, bishop h5, and then knight to g5, and we mate black. Rook e8 takes over, and you can mate this way or that way. Okay, so to the game. Knight to g5 was played. And as I said, this is also very logical. The knight is quite dangerously posted there, and white wants to play h5 as quickly as possible. Takes, and now it might seem surprising, but white plays, and always plays, king takes e2 here. And the reason is that, well, there are a couple of reasons. So one is that we're connecting the rooks, and another is that the queen on d2 is well posted. It can sometimes go to h6, sometimes go to c3. Okay, now here, once upon a time, black played e6. This wasn't the main move for a while, but it looks like this is just busted. The most recent important game with this is Avrukh against Emil Satovsky from Ashdod in 2004. Satovsky is one of the world's greatest Grunfeld experts. I mean, among, I think, consistent Grunfeld players, maybe he's only behind Svidler in terms of his understanding and success with this opening. Okay, well, anyway, here's how it goes. h5, knight c4, queen c1, so keeping the knight on g5 protected. E takes d5, hg, fg, rook takes h7, queen f6, and all of this has happened, I think, quite a few times, actually. At least several times. f4, b6, rook to b3, rook a to e8, and rook b to h3, rook to e7, rook 7 to h6, and okay, here black has several tries, but none of them are very good. So, for instance, if queen to g7, white just plays g4, tightens the screws, prepares maybe f5 in some cases, and black is just in big trouble. If rook f to e8, the idea of rook takes e4 and hoping for some counterplay, then white has a brilliant move here, king f2. And the point is that rook takes e4 doesn't come with check, and because of that, rook to h8 does come with check and is just winning outright. So instead, black has to play queen to d4 check, and then after king to g3, white is winning according to Krasenkov, another very strong grandmaster who's a Grunfeld regular, and my computer agrees with him. So this is losing for black. Okay. Finally, there's the move Satovsky played against Avrukh, knight to d6. So queen to d2, threatening queen takes d5 check. Now queen to d3, sort of threatening queen to b3 or queen to c4 if the knight ever leaves. Well, definitely threatening it if the knight leaves, only sort of threatening it right now because of c4. But there's also the further threat of playing e5 and then taking on g6. So black played knight to f7 trying to chop off some of the wood on the king side, but queen to c4 really kind of threw a monkey wrench in his plans. So black now tries desperately to get the to ease the pressure on the a2 g8 diagonal and on the h-file, but doesn't help. So you can see white still keeps the pin. Satovsky tried a really desperate trick with rook to e5, but Avrukh was up to the challenge here. So f takes e5, queen g5, and now doesn't retreat the rook, but plays e6. And after queen takes h6, not ef, but rook f3, and after queen h2, he doesn't take on f7, but plays e7. And now all of a sudden, black is just busted. He can't move the rook because then he loses everything. I mean, queen takes f7 check is devastating. And, well, if he leaves the rook there, then ef, and then we take on f7. So, or also the threats to play rook takes f7, rook f7, e8, queen. So black tried to give some checks and then to retreat, but again, rook f7 works here too. Queen d8. And black played a couple more moves and simply resigned here. So this put e6 out of business. So e6 is a goner. So black plays h6, which looks really, really risky, but it seems to be okay. I mean, I don't see any win against this. All right, white has some very promising continuations, but no knockout blow as far as I can tell. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if someone finds one at some point. Anyway, there are 3 moves that have been played here. 2 of them are very similar. Knight f3 was played in the game. And that works out quite similarly to knight h3. In fact, they often just transpose. So let's look at the independent move first, which is h5. So after this, hg, hg. And now, the most common move here in terms of frequency in the database is f takes g6. But I think that this one is a loser. This one, I think, has to disappear. So queen g5, threatening, of course, queen g6 mate. Rook h6, amping up the threat there. And now, simple slow move, rook to h3. And it's remarkable. I mean, white is a full piece down and doesn't seem to have anything so threatening. But black's, well, first of all, black has 3 of his pieces over on the a file, not exactly helping too much with the king. I mean, the queen is certainly helping, but the knight isn't, the rook isn't. White's d and e pawns can be very dangerous, and there's pressure on the h file as well. So just to kind of go through the line, king g8, getting out of the way of queen h6, and also getting out of the way of queen takes e7 with check. So now white just plays very calmly, e5. And again, just calm moves, allows this exchange, but just keeps going. e6. Now, black plays queen at e3 to bring the queen back into the defense, but even here, white is just in great shape. So queen g5, and now if king f8, rook c1 takes away the checks. Okay, and also threatens rook c5. If b6, then check, check, e7, and ultimately white wins with this. Okay, if queen to h7, then rook takes c5 is winning. So that's simple. So b6 is the better try, but it's not good enough. All right, instead of king to f8 though, black can play king to h7 and just try to stay off of the f file. But white wins like this in this case. So rook to d1. Okay, actually this one is maybe not winning. This is just much better for white. But so white has 2 pawns, tremendously dangerous d and e pawns, and if the rook can start bothering the black king, it'll be over fast. But it's not quite over at this point. Okay, so that said, while it may not quite be over, it's still very bad for black. So f takes g6 is not the move nowadays. Instead, queen to d6 is what seems to be best. Just returning the knight, just like the way black plays against many gambits. Let's say e4, e5 gambits. You take the material, and then you give it back to achieve a solid position. So queen a5, queen g6, f3, b6, queen c3, f6. And it's funny, I mean, both sides have kind of consolidated. I mean, you have these matching pawn chains. So black's got 2 pawn chains, and white has the big one. And both sides seem to be solid enough. I mean, the board could open up again, and some exciting things happen. But for the moment, at least, it seems to be stable. This is played twice by an international master, I believe, named Knott, K-N-O-T-T, and he drew both games, and it seems to be reasonable. So this, I think, suggests that at least h5 can perhaps be tamed. All right, now let's get to the fun stuff. Knight h3. Okay, the threat's, of course, to play queen takes h6, so king to h7 looks like the better move. If you go to g7, then queen c3 comes with check. So king h7, queen c3, and now this looks very, very scary. I mean, knight to g5 looks like a threat because you can't take because of the mate, and if he goes back, well, what was he doing on h7? Then you play h5, but it turns out it's not so easy. All right, now before I mention b6, which is the main move, I'll just note that e5 was played by Michalewski back in 2008 against a fairly low-rated opponent named Tarnopolsky. So Tarnopolsky played f4, but I think the better way to play is de. Black should probably just trade queens. And white's a little bit better here. And this in fact took place in a game between Susan Polgar and De La Villa Garcia back in 1991, and she went on to win the game with white. So back to queen c3. The best move is b6. Now knight to g5 check, king g8, h5. So again, this looks terrifying for black, but it's not so easy. hg, hg, and this time you do play f takes g6. You can't play something like f6 because, well, actually, yeah, just queen h3. I was thinking about rook h8 check for a second, and then started getting hung up on what if he plays king to g7. But just king to queen h3 ends the game instantly. So this is a blunder. So f takes g6, rook h8 check, king f7, rook h8, king e7, queen g7. Looks scary, right? King to d7, d6. Okay, neither way, the pawn can't safely be captured either way. And excuse me, after queen to e8, d takes e7, rook g8, queen e5. White has gone 4-0 from this position. Now, I think when I ran the engine on this at one point, it seemed to think that black was okay, but I don't really believe it. I think the 4-0 is not a coincidence. Now maybe there's some miracle defense that black has that just holds on. But what I think that Kamsky probably had in mind, if Shulman had gone down this route, was rook to e8. So this hasn't been played before, but it's quite logical. I mean, so you simply shore up the e pawn without wasting time. So it's a tough position in any case. I mean, whatever's going on here, white certainly has lots of compensation, but this, I'm sure, is what Kamsky had worked out very, very carefully. Okay, so a lot of fun, but probably black is all right here. Now let's get to the game. So Shulman, instead of knight to h3, played knight to f3, but this can just transpose. So king h7, and again here, queen c3, b6, knight g5, and we're back to the other to the position that we've already seen. Well, since we already looked at that, let's consider some other possible moves. As I said, Shulman played something else. He played e5, which was a new move, but not one that he planned. I mean, he thought for like 20 minutes here, and he was burning up clock time like crazy. He was clearly not ready for this variation. Another move that looks logical, but it's not as good here, is h5. The problem is that black can play g5, which is what knight to g5 check first is, of course, designed to take care of. The knight sack would just do nothing. Okay, maybe that's exaggerating a little bit, but there aren't enough open lines for white to really make something good happen with the knight sack. e5 was trying a game, relatively low-level game. Cruz Lopez Claret, who's 2265 against, again, the same De La Villa Garcia that I mentioned before. And this was played in Lleida in 1991. Black won fairly quickly, but it was, again, I think the rating disparity as much as anything else. So white makes all of these kind of temporizing moves, only finally sacrifices the piece, and in a situation where it's just terrible. I mean, yeah, it's awful. So takes, and now rook to g8, queen 8, queen e7, cd. Black's up a rook for 2 pawns. White has no real attack, but black will have an attack. And here white resigned. So he's probably just getting mated here, and mated quickly. Okay, so that is how that went, and certainly can't be recommended. So queen to c3 would be the way to go, and just that very complicated position from here is what needs to be examined. Rook to e8, the novelty there, and the line that's been played also I think needs to be checked. Okay, well, to our game finally, and no more theory. So after e5, Kamsky played knight to c4, queen to c3, queen to d3, knight to b6. So the knight is now in a better square. It blocks the b file, it hits the d pawn, and it's not loose there anymore either. On the other hand, it gives white 2 or 3 moves to improve his position and to make something useful happen. So here white played h5. Maybe rook b to d1 is worth considering too, just trying to keep the tension. I mean, he's only down a pawn, and if he can keep this beautiful center intact, then that may have some hopes too. So, for instance, king to g7, getting off this pin, h5, g5, rook h to e1, and I think this is playable for either side. All right, in the game, Shulman played h5, so just a more direct approach. Kamsky took, of course, hg, and here maybe Kamsky missed a small opportunity. He played f takes g6, which is very, very natural. But maybe king to g7, as crazy as it looks, is playable. And you'll see the reason why. I mean, basically it's that after f takes g6, white gets knight to g5 check, and after king g7 takes, there's knight e6. And this leads to massive liquidation. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But after king to g7, that option's at least no longer open. So let's say queen to e3, hitting h6, and now h5. Funny move. Rook h5, queen c4 check. The point, though, is that if white plays king to e1, then rook to h8, and all of a sudden white has some troubles here. Black is actually a lot better now because white's first rank has become rather weak. So white should play instead queen to d3, but now takes, f takes g6, and black is still up that one pawn and still has some chances. So this, I think, would have been black's best bet, and I think he's a little bit better. White has some play for the pawn, but not full compensation. The best thing that white has going for him, I think, is the pressure on the b file. I mean, white may play for a4, a5, and try to tie black down to that weakness there. Okay, well, as I said, in the game, Kamsky played the very natural f takes g6, and I'm sure practically everyone would do that unless they had checked it on the computer first. So, knight to g5, king g7, takes, knight e6, king f7, knight f8, knight e3, king e3, takes. So, white has regained the pawn thanks to that last capture, and with material equal and white's rook active, there's no problem. So, king e6, rook a7, g5, the point being to prevent f4, rook c7, rook a8, rook c5, and here the draw was agreed. So of course black is doing fine. He takes on a2 next, and black is, I guess, microscopically better, but well, not really, because white's going to play rook c6. So for instance, rook takes a2, rook c6, king e5, rook h6, and this is just a dead draw. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing else to be done. Oh, I suppose white could throw in rook to a, or black could throw in rook to a3 check, maybe a little finesse here. But okay, king e4, rook a2, rook c6 here, takes, g3, and this is certainly no danger for white. Maybe it's even microscopically dangerous for black, because he might have some problems with the g5 pawn. So yeah, rook a2, the immediate rook a2 looks like a better decision. Anyway, this is quite drawn in any case. So very impressive bit of preparation by Kamsky. I mean, not in the sense that this variation I think is 100% okay. Maybe it is, but I'm not willing to say that. But it's okay enough, and he had prepared so well that it just worked perfectly as a surprise weapon. In fact, Kamsky used only, I think, 5 or 10 minutes for the entire game, plus the increments, while Shulman was down to 19 minutes by this point, by the end of the game, here after rook takes c5. So, fascinating variation, and I hope you enjoyed exploring it with me. And certainly, if you guys still look at it, I'd love to see what you come up with in the comments section to the post as well. So, thanks a lot. Finally, let me mention a couple of things here before I go. Let me mention my blog. It's at thechessmind.net, so thechessmind.net. And also, let me remind people, or maybe not remind, but just tell people that I give chess lessons. So if you're interested in that, you can send me either a message on here on this server, or you can use the contact link on the right side of my blog. So scroll down, you'll see it on the right side. So you can drop me a note if you're interested, and we can discuss that. All right. So thanks a lot, everybody, and I will see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.